Hi everyone, welcome back to Asian Art. Today we will continue our discussion of Bali and we'll look more closely at the temples and the performances that take place inside them. To begin with, I want to repeat the idea that I mentioned earlier in the last lecture, that the island of Bali itself is regarded a kind of temple that has a spiritual body. The center and the most important part of this spiritual body is the mountain Gunung Agung, which is the spiritual direction which they call Kaja, toward the mountain. Away from the mountain, you head away from that kind of abode of the gods toward the ocean and toward the spiritual pollution, which is called Kalod. These two directions, Kaja and Kalod, are important words in determining even just ordinary directions. On an island, we don't use north, south, east, and west. People just simply refer to turning to Kaja or turning to Kalod. But the words also have other kinds of meaning and spiritual dimensions, including those I mentioned earlier, this idea of toward the gods and the abode of the gods up in the mountain, and away from the gods into the realm of the demons in the ocean. Temples on the island of Bali are oriented toward the mountain, Kaja, where the most sacred part, the innermost courtyard, is considered the place where the ancestors abide. The middle courtyard is a place where ceremonies take place and offerings are prepared. And then the outer courtyard in the south, in the Kalod direction, is a place where people gather and meetings take place. It's a much more sort of secular space. As you can see here, we mentioned before the three-part division of the spiritual life of the Balinese: the mountain, the realm of the gods, the realm of the humans, and the realm of the sea spirits and evil pollutions in the ocean. And this sort of three-part division, as we also see in the temples, we also saw in the way there are three different kinds of temples in each town. A typical temple will have a front gateway that looks something like this. It's called the split gate. And if you recall, looking back on the temple in East Java, we saw a similarly split temple. This kind of temple design comes from southern India, called the Gapura. This here in Bali, this split gate is called the Chandi Bendar, or split gateway. Through this gateway is the middle courtyard, and beyond at the other end of the middle courtyard you can see a kind of towering gateway, and that is the Chandi Kurung. This is a fairly typical temple facade, richly carved in elaborate relief carvings. You can see a few mask faces and other kinds of decorations on the temple. Temples usually have a pair of stairs going up, and there's a sense of going higher and higher into the temple as you head toward the more spiritual realms of the temple. The most sacred temple in Bali is the mother temple at Purapasaki. Here you can see a very huge staircase going up to a split gate. Looking from the other direction, from down into the courtyard, you can see how the innermost courtyard is situated. In this innermost courtyard at Purapasaki, they have these very tall, towering structures, which are sort of based like Chinese pagodas. The Chinese form here is this kind of spiritual building that is used in Buddhism, but in this case here it is used to create a place of sanctuary for the gods of Hinduism and their ancestors. Bali temple construction is pretty standard throughout, although the decorations and ornamentation, the kinds of construction is very basic. They don't use any mortar in the building of the temples. They are stacking high-fired red bricks and then inserting in there a kind of softer sandstone which is richly carved, creating this kind of red orange brick with these sort of gray ornamental details. This, if you see, is a sort of classic example of the Balinese architecture, which you believe is sort of based on how temples were built during the Majapahit period. In the innermost courtyard of the sacred temple, special kinds of activities happen there. They are the kinds of activities that happen during emergencies or crises, a time when there is an infection or a disease or a crop failure or a volcanic eruption. All of these kinds of events would warrant a sense of spiritual crisis in the community that needs to be addressed by these special rituals. These rituals are very old. They come from a time before the arrival of the Majapahit Hinduism, and they often involve a kind of non-narrative trance performances where a person or persons enter into a spiritual state whereby a deity enters their body and they are transformed into that deity and they are treated as emissaries of the deity. This is one of those such rituals called Sangyang Dedari. In it, young prepubescent girls go into trance, and a spiritual being, sort of like a yakshi from we've talked about before, the Dedari, comes into the girl and speaks to the community about what is causing the crisis and allows them to address the deity and find solutions in a spiritual capacity to the crisis that they confront. Sangyang Dedari usually involves several different stages, and one part of the stages is where the child performer in trance is shown to be possessed by the deity. Often they will dance in trance, even though they have no formal dance training. The young girls will perform a classical dance. Or they may do other stunts that perform, that show that they are capable to endure the pain because they are protected by the spirit within them. Another kind of important dance performed by men in the innermost temple is called the Baris dance. Men perform this dance in preparation for war. It shows that they are prepared to die in battle to protect the temple and the community. Baris simply means standing in a line, and it is often a kind of military performance, sometimes performed with weapons, but often without. It is a classic dance that all young men are expected to be able to perform. Baris dances are characterized by this very distinctive crown you see here. It's sort of spade-shaped. Inside the crown are tiny pieces of mother of pearl, and as the dancer moves, the crown shimmers with light. In the middle courtyard, a different kind of performances can be found. Here, the Bali traditions are performed during ceremonial occasions. They are planned, they are according to the Balinese calendar, they happen on certain events. Professional performers are hired for their skill and their talents to give entertainments to the gods and to the people. And the community will support, as much as they can afford, the best performer for the occasion. These kinds of traditions clearly derive from the arrival of the Majapahit kingdom. They have this Hindu-Javanese origin. Many of them are narrative, and they tell stories of the Hindu epics or of their own histories. Here we see a picture of a man performing Wayang Kulit Purwa, which is the Balinese shadow theater. You can see he's sitting before a banana log, and he is conducting an orchestra with his left hand. He is wrapping the inside of the puppet case. In his right hand, he is holding a leather puppet, which is carefully incised with lines, and the lamp in front of his face is casting a shadow onto the white screen before him. The audience sits on the other side of the screen, and they see the shadows of the puppets, not the puppets themselves. Wayang kulit is a very ancient and popular art form in Bali, and it celebrates the histories and stories of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Another very important part of Bali traditions is that they are really the talent of the performer that matters. They rarely, if ever, go into trance, and the performers are known for their skill and their ability to put on a good show. These kinds of rituals are performed at annual holidays, the birth of a child, weddings, funeral celebrations. All of these occasions are marked by special offerings and special prayers. Here we see a carver who's preparing to make a mask. Notice that he has an offering on the piece of wood. He is saying prayers to making sure that the mask is successful. These kinds of practices show a ritual care, for every step of the process of carving the wood and making a spiritual mask. Not all masks or all carvings require this, but if you're making a mask that's going to be performed with any kind of spiritual capacity, then great care is taken to even the cutting down of the tree that will be used to make the mask. As I mentioned before, the talent of the performer is more important than their ability, some kind of going into trance. That said, talent is controlled as an idea in Bali that they call taksu. And people will sort of have these shrines in their homes where they will make an offering to taksu. This is called the place of taksu. Taksu is not a deity or a god. It's sort of an innate ability a person has to be sort of the best they can be. It's a unique skill someone has that sort of transcends ordinary activities. It can be typically seen in a dancer who is so skilled, they make it look effortless what they're doing. They bring a kind of power and supernatural wonder to what they are performing. This kind of experience is a prized experience for the Balinese. It shows that there's a deep affinity for the spiritual life being infused into the performance activities. Taksu as an idea means that the gods are helping you. The gods are there to assist you. They're not taking over. They're just kind of making it possible for you to succeed and perform way beyond what ordinary people can do. And so taksu is a kind of a value judgment that shows that something is deeply successful in its accomplishment. One of the traditions that you can find in the middle courtyard is called Topeng Panjagan. This is a one-man mass tradition where one person, mostly male, will put on a mask and do a series of dances and eventually tell a story, each mask coming out in turn, performing dances and narration that will sort of give us different perspectives on this traditional story. Topeng Panjagan has a wonderful tradition because it really celebrates the diversity and skill of a performer to be both entertaining and a very engaging and complex relationships between the different characters that they present. The beginning of a Topeng Panjagan is called the Panglembar, and this always is the same regardless of the story that is performed. It begins with a series of dances by 3 different characters. The performer comes out first dressed as a heroic minister who comes to meet the king. And then there is a slightly different heroic minister. And then there is a third and final older minister, Orang Tua, who comes out. He was once a proud and noble warrior, but today he is a little old and worn and slow and cannot quite perform to the same speed and power. He adds a kind of comical twist to the performance, but he also shows a kind of beauty and the fragility of strength and power. So this is a very interesting thing about Balini's performance, this idea of inclusion. It's not just going to show us the ideals of these people, but it starts to bring in a kind of ordinary humanity to each of the characters that are presented. In our story of Topeng Panjagan, you will see heroic kings that come out that are, there to represent the virtues and ideals in Balini's life. These masks you see are fairly naturalistic. The teeth are inlaid with mother of pearl, and the facial hair is actually, if not painted, is often used special boar hide, which gives it a kind of sleek, and the eyebrows as well give it a kind of sleek, natural quality. Another interesting part about Topeng Panjagan are the Bondres characters that come out toward the end of the performance. These are comic interludes, and these characters can be anything the masked performer has that he wants to introduce to the story. They can be, as you see on the left, the village gossip, the woman who loves to talk about her neighbors. Or it could be like the character on the right, a kind of homely man who has a birth defect, but he has a sweetheart and he loves to sing songs even though he sings in a kind of funny, awkward voice. These Bondres characters are very popular, and again, they extend the narrative of the traditional heroic stories into the ordinary, the prosaic, the quotidian, and they bring the stories down to earth so that everyday people can make their comments and ideas understood. At the end of the tradition of Topeng Panjagan, you have a closing ceremony which is officiated by Sita Karya, whose name means the one who can do the deed. Sita Karya is a kind of scary mask with his long curling fangs, but he's also a kind of jovial character. And he's one that is both frightening and benevolent. In this way, he comes out. He is considered the sort of quintessential outsider. He's a person who has been banished, kicked out of the kingdom, only to be invited back to close the ceremony. The story of Sita Karya goes back to the history of Bali, when it was said one day a king was met by a visitor who claimed to be a long-lost uncle. The king refused to acknowledge the visitor as a long-lost uncle and sent him away. The kingdom fell into trouble, plagues, and disease ran through the kingdom, and the king, searching for help, asked his ministers, who sought the advice of the gods. The ministers came back and told him, well, that man you kicked out, he was actually somebody you need to allow to officiate the ceremony. So Sita Karya, the one banished, was brought back and is allowed to now officiate the closing of the ceremony. The mask is usually performed by somebody who would be a Sudra, a low-caste, ordinary person, not a high-caste person. Yet in his capacity as Sita Karya, the performer acts like a Brahmin priest. And this is a very interesting idea because it also crosses the ideas of caste and inclusion and brings forth new ideas in Balini's life that allows everyone to play a role. In the outermost courtyard, Bali Balihan performances are secular dances. These are performances that can be done on any occasion. Things that might happen like the arrival of a tourist bus or a prosperous year in the village and everyone just wants to put on a show. There are numerous kinds of performances that can happen in these, but very often you'll see something called kechak. There are some offerings that are made, some prayers that are said to protect the performers, but these very casual performances are meant to be open to the public and not require any particular occasion or emergency to be performed. Kechak is a very interesting tradition. It's really not even 100 years old, And it was created when a movie company came to Bali and wanted to film the Balinese rituals. And the Balinese were very uncomfortable with this. So they decided to invent a tradition that they could perform for this movie. They enjoyed doing this, and it combined a number of things that were fairly easy for them to do and were not expensive to perform. And so this chanting and dance performance became known as kechak, which is actually just the sound of the chanting that they make. Kechak also sometimes is referred to as the monkey dance, which is a dance whereby the performers sometimes enact the role of the monkey army in the Ramayana. The story of Kechak is the Ramayana, and the story is often told and performed in places in Bali. Here you see a performance on the coast, and the young dancers there are surrounded by a chorus of 150 men who are chanting. Not all performances or ceremonies happen inside the temple. There's one very important and special ceremony that happens outside the temple in the area which is designated for a graveyard. This is the holding place for bodies that are preparing to be cremated. And so it is a spiritually dangerous place and a place associated with black magic. This performance, called the Chalunarong, features two important characters, the Barong, the forest spirit, and Rangda, the witch. Rangda, you see here on the left, has grabbed the beard of the Barong and is chiding him and complaining about being neglected and abused. So in this way, the battle of the Chalunarong is the forces of good and evil that come into confrontation, and is a way of dealing with and coming to terms with the presence of black magic in the community. First, let's look at the barong. The barong is actually performed by two people. One person who plays the front legs and holds the wood mask in their forearms. This is sort of in the style of a Chinese lion dance it may be based on. The body is covered in a long, shaggy mane, which is horsehair. And then there are these beautifully intricately cut sheets of leather, gilded with gold and mirrors, inlaid with mirrors. The barong mask is carved wood, and there's a back legs that hold up the rear of the lion, or the barong ket. There are many different kinds of barong. Specifically, this variety is called the barong ket. Rangda is clearly the most terrifying mask in all of the Balinese pantheon of gods and demons. These huge curving fangs, flaming tongue, and wild bulging eyes represent a passionate and destructive force in their lives. Rangda is the queen of black magic. She is a widow. She is a woman outside the family. She is a woman who has untold powers, and she is willing to use them to her own personal gain and to the destruction of others. Rangda, you see here, these long curling fang and fingernails, is danced by a man and performs the sort of erratic and irrational part of the Balinese life, someone who is not controlled by the social mores and values held by most in the community. The meeting of the barong and the rangda is an occasion for a trance. The soldiers of the forest spirit, the barong ket, come to attack Rangda, but Rangda turns them against themselves. They pull out their daggers that they used to attack her on themselves, and here they try mightily to stab themselves. But the forest spirit, the barong, is protecting them. So even though they are trying to stab themselves, to kill themselves with their own weapons, the barong prevents them from being harmed. And so in this struggle between the barong and the rangda, the two are seen as having equal forces. Neither one can succeed. This is very different than what we often see in battles between good and evil elsewhere. Here in Bali, the struggle between good and evil is not that one will ultimately defeat and destroy the other, but that one and another will find they each have enough power to keep the other in check. Here are some questions I want you to consider. What kinds of Wali events occur in the innermost temple? When do Bali events occur, and how are they different from Wali events? What is the difference between Bali and Bali Balihan traditions? Why is the Chalanarang performed?